provides support and resources for open source projects. And we're pleased to work with a whole host of open source communities. How I get involved with Boundless is I'm actually the project lead on the project steering committee of several open source projects that, GeoTools and GeoServer are part of the Open Source Geospatial Foundation. And I also work on a project called UDIG, which is part of Location Tech. And these are our two groups that are organizing today's conference. I also have a chance to volunteer. And as a volunteer, I work with the Open Source Geospatial Foundation. I'm recently kind of punching above my weight class here as an OSGeo board member. So I'm trying that out. It's a little bit terrifying. I'm also the OSGeo Incubation Chair. So I help welcome new open source projects to the foundation, and I help mentor them through some of the trials and tribulations of not being embarrassing in public. And so it's a really rewarding role. And then formally, I'm the GeoTools project officer. So I get to report from the GeoTools community to the OSGeo board and let them know how we're doing. With the Eclipse Foundation, I'm just been reinstated on the steering committee. So I'm the committer representation on the steering committee. And then I also work with their technology project, which is, it's similar to the OSGeo Incubation Chair. It is an umbrella project that gets to support everybody. So that's kind of how I roll. And why I get to enjoy speaking with you today. So FOSS4G stands for Free and Open Source Software for Geomatics. But really, the legend about FOSS4G is it is an event like this. It is a party. People really come here to celebrate all the work they are doing and all the work that open source enables them to do. And it is quite the institution. Now, this is taken yesterday. People having a good time. You can really see the party atmosphere. FOSS4G in various forms has been being held since 2004 was the first one, I think, in Thailand. It really is a good time. I've got some pictures here. I could do the whole slide or the whole presentation just of fun pictures of people enjoying being part of this community. These slides are taken from any number of events around the world: Korea, Denver, Nottingham, Victoria, Barcelona, Sydney, all kinds of good stuff. Pardon? Lausanne? I never usually manage to say that the same way twice, so I skipped that one. So the first event here was actually held by the GRASS user community, which is one of the original open source projects from the dawn of time. Do we have anyone from the GRASS community here? Okay. GRASS is one of the original open source projects. It actually kind of predates the internet. So it was open source, and they ended up passing the source code around by like tape drive and courier and wagon train, near as I can tell. And it's also a series of global events. A lot of these global events have been organized by the Open Source Geospatial Foundation, which was formed in 2006. And then it also has a series of regional events. So I didn't hunt down all the regional logos, but here's a couple ones from recent FOSS4G North America events. And what I'm actually here to talk to you about is not so much the event. You are going to have a great time at the event. There's a really wide, diverse program, but most of the action is going to be in the breaks, trying to get into the coffee line, in the bird of a feather session this evening. Those are also a really valuable experience. And also just all the conversations you'll get going out to dinner or having breakfast with people. One of the things that makes this community so wonderful is it's a little bit of a lifestyle choice. We choose to be free. I'm going to have a chance to explain to you all the different freedoms that we are embracing. Now, these are the pillars of what enable this community to thrive. Open data, open standards, open source, and I tend to really emphasize, above all, open, inclusive collaboration. So I'm going to have a chance to talk to you about each one of these aspects. Who here is familiar with open data? Okay, a couple people. Can anyone give me like an example of open data? Okay. This isn't a participatory crowd yet. We'll work on it. So having our software without data is a little bit like having a piano without music. Especially in our industry, we really need data in order to thrive. One thing that's kind of unique about our industry, which makes it a little bit hard to run a software foundation, is software is really not very special. In our industry, data is really where it's at. We spend so much money and resources collecting the information, and the data that we collect really outlives the software projects. And we know that going in. So the data is expensive, time-consuming to collect, and it's also very valuable. So you will be using today's modern open-source software to process data that was collected in the dawn of time, like the 1970s or the 1870s. So yeah, just keep that in mind, that the software is transitory. What you do with it and the data you collect, that's where the lasting value is. So open data actually has a very specific meaning. We are focused on data that is freely available to use, but the crucial part that makes it open data is that you have the ability to republish it. The best open data stories I can tell are when not only you can republish the data, but there's a mechanism for you to contribute back. So we really want to see, for open data, that life cycle where the data is published, the community can use it, and the community can contribute back. That's our goal. That's what we're going for. So this is, the poster child for this one is the OpenStreetMap project, which began in the United Kingdom. And it's a little bit hard to imagine, especially from people from North America. In North America, we've got the Canadian government and the American government that both publish their spatial information to the public and to industry to reuse and to enjoy. It's being paid for out of the public purse. The public should darn well have use of it. In the United Kingdom, they were focused really on a cost recovery model. And so the public couldn't necessarily get access to maps until like a 50-year limit had expired. So you saw people, organizing a yard sale, and the map they were using still had like bomb craters on it in London. So it was a little bit embarrassing. OpenStreetMaps formed almost like in a wiki sense. So they were using like GPS tracks collected on bicycles. And so they started from the ground up, closing that loop, allowing the community to contribute. GeoNames is another one. This is a point of interest data set. And one that's really kind of fun and central to our industry is the EPSG geodetic parameter data set. This is one that's been collected a little bit more at the institution and corporate level. And this is the database that allows us to track where information is on the world. So it doesn't do us very much good to measure the shape of a geometry. We actually need to know what that shape was being measured against. And we need to have a consistent model, the spatial reference system, between our software applications so that we can take information collected by one team and share it with another. So this is a slightly different game than free data, which is really just free of charge. We're really focused on open data, which is free for collaboration. So here's a couple of the groups we're working with. I already mentioned GeoNames. Here's OpenStreetMap and the EPSG data set. So who here has used GeoNames? Anyone? A couple of people. It's a really nice resource. They have an interesting model, so their data is published time delayed for the public, but if you subscribe and pay money to support the project, you can get access to the latest data. OpenStreetMaps, who's used OpenStreetMaps? Excellent, a wonderful success story. And who here has used the EPSG database? Okay, if you've used any GIS software since the 70s, you've used the EPSG database. Okay, yep.
Can you speak about the quality control for these data sets?
Certainly. It depends on the group and how focused they are on quality. You'll see that the OpenStreetMap data set varies widely around the world based on the different groups that are collecting information. Some governments choose to dump their authoritative data sets one way into the community, but they haven't yet set up the governance model to take contributions and fixes, which the public no doubt provide, back into the authoritative data set. One thing that's kind of an interesting mix is you can have this balance between a data set being authoritative, like managed by a municipality, but if it's not actually used and available in OpenStreetMaps, it doesn't end up in people's phones and in all the different web applications, and so it doesn't do the public any good. So there's a little bit of a schism there between having an authoritative data set that is behind a paywall or 6 months out of date versus providing something to the public in a venue where they can benefit and contribute back. So we've got a little bit of tension there. The EPSG data set is very heavily monitored just because it's very expensive. If there's any accuracy deficiencies in the EPSG database. EPSG stood originally for a European Petroleum Standards Group, and so this was a group from the oil industry that got really fed up due to accuracy issues. It was embarrassing for them if they took one of their $500 million oil rigs and ran it into a reef and it sank. They got a little bit tired of the GIS vendors saying, oh, you should have checked if the data was in the same projection. And so in a little bit of a customer revolt, they set up this standards group in order to give the GIS industry less excuses, saying, here, these are the codes we want you to use for interoperability for sake of crashing our oil rigs. GeoNames is very much community driven. I don't think they have a lot of QA in place other than just public review. So the public will find out, hey, that's not what my town is called. It has an extra apostrophe here. And then it's up to the public to revise the next data set. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I was also just interested in who supplies the infrastructure. I'm just thinking like my daughter's third grade class going out and mapping.
Right. So OpenStreetMap I'm not sure they have a very sustainable infrastructure funding model. They keep doing fundraising drives in order to afford more and more infrastructure. But their data set is freely published, and you'll see a lot of organizations taking a copy of the data set for their own use and not leaning on the very heavily loaded community servers. GeoNames, as I said, is backed by like a subscription model, and EPSG has like a member association. It has a foundation behind it. Another question?
Yeah, so I was at the one in Minneapolis 3 years ago.
Yep.
Wasn't there development being done like a web front end where you could report, like you saw something wrong with the street map? Oh, yeah.
Right. So the question was, in terms of QA, wasn't there a web front end being developed? Yeah, there was a scholarship grant by the Knight Foundation to help generate that. I think Mapbox also put a bunch of resources behind that. So there is certainly much improved editors for the public to gather feedback.
And a variety of mobile ones.
Yeah.
I think Mapbox is the one. Okay.
Excellent. So I just want to move on to open standards. So open data is wonderful and all, but unless you can actually share it with people, who cares? And so this open standards really is the key innovation in our industry. It kind of took place over the course of the 90s that enabled our open source community to develop and flourish. So what I mean by an open standard is the standard is defining how the software can communicate together, and it's available as a specification that anyone, even our open source projects, can implement. This is like really the glue that we use to communicate between all our components. One thing that's really nice is this allows you as integrators to take components from different open source projects and use them together. So I work for a project called GeoServer, which can act as a service to publish maps. Another really nice project is MapServer, that's also an OSGeo project, and it also follows the same specification. You can substitute one for the other as is appropriate for your solution. And you can also take, say, a proprietary implementation and start to explore some of the open source alternatives by using the fact that these standards break everything into components. So this is one of the central stories that allows our community to take shape. So these open standards are going to fall into a couple different categories. People are probably familiar with ISO, the International Standard Organization. They tend to put their little stickers on almost everything, from like the steel on the chair that you're sitting on to like tires and tire pressures to mapping standards on the internet. The mapping standards that we follow as an industry are known as TC211. I have no idea what that stands for. These standards are really good, and often they provide us a common vocabulary to work together for things like geometry and web service and feature and so on. But they have not seen a lot of adoption in our open source community because ISO operates on a ineffective business model. So the ISO standards often cost a fee for people to download, and that fee keeps a lot of our volunteers from purchasing a standard and implementing it. Another standard, another international standard organization you might be familiar with is W3C. They define protocols like HTTP, and they're starting to get involved in our industry, which is really nice to see. I think the GeoJSON is starting to work with W3C, so we'll get to see a few more geometry stories out of W3C. Any questions on these guys? They're really boring, but they get the job done. Go team. Industry standards have been far more successful for us. In particular, we have a great relationship with the Open Geospatial Consortium. One of the things we really like about them is we can download their standards for free, and they're a wonderful service because they name things for us. That way our community members don't have to spend ages on emails trying to decide what to call things. They really have been instrumental in unlocking everything for us. And the EPSG data set is also kind of defined at this level as an industry standard. And this one's kind of near and dear to my heart. We also have community standards. GeoJSON is kind of our most famous one. This is a bunch of developers who got really sick of trying to share geometry using XML and decided to say, hey, we're JavaScript developers. We can use JSON for everything, and they were right. Another really nice one is GeoTIFF. Does anyone use GeoTIFF? That's actually a community standard. A GeoTIFF is actually just a normal TIFF, but people have agreed what metadata to fill in the file header in order to tell the software applications where that TIFF should be drawn on the world. And that was originally defined ad hoc by projects collaborating. Another interesting one is MB Tiles. That was started by a single company, but they've published it as a community standard. And a really fun one is WMSC, or caching. And this was actually a community standard defined at a FOSS4G event, just like this one, FOSS4G 2006 in Lausanne. Did I say it right? Failed. Okay. But that was really fun because I actually got to sit in that meeting and watch it happen. I had no idea what was going on. And then we also exist in the real world. Remember that the data is important here, not the software projects. So we do have to pay attention to de facto standards, things like shapefile or Oracle Spatial or MapInfo. The data is important. We need to ensure that all of our software can make use of it. So here's just a couple examples. We got ISO, we've got the OGC, and GeoJSON. Some of those community standards will be defined on nice little GitHub pages like GeoJSON. Some of them will be buried in an OSGeo wiki. All right, now here's probably, well, do you guys have any questions on community standards? We got one? Yep.
Yes, who oversees GeoTIFF? What community is responsible for that?
So the question was, who oversees the GeoTIFF community standard? And the answer is, I'd have to go to the webpage and look. As long as it works, I didn't personally care. I think it's been really, really stable. The GeoJSON standard's been a little bit more active. I think they have a mailing list. And they've been actively simplifying their standard and throwing out complexity, which is always a good move for reaching a wider audience. In particular, they threw out the idea of coordinate reference systems, which is amazing and terrifying to any GIS professional, but really helps us reach a wider web developer community. Okay, any other questions? Standards make it go, but they're not the most exciting. How am I doing for time? Okay. So here's probably what you thought you were coming to hear about, which is open source. But I really only have one thing to say about open source, and I can say it many times if you want me to. If you download the application, you can also download a copy of the source. That's really what open source is. I know that we describe things in terms of an open source community, but in terms of what open source is, it's a license, and the license always says this. One thing that's really nice about open source licenses is they're a lot easier to follow than commercial licenses. So here we've got a one-page BSD license versus a 7-page iTunes license. Someone told me when they were reviewing this slide that it's now a 42-page iTunes license. I'm not going to keep updating this slide. I just want to take a moment to show this one-page BSD license. I'm not sure if you can read that, but this license only has 2 clauses. One of it says that, hey, you must retain this copyright notice, and that if you distribute the binary, you should also retain this copyright notice and this list of 2 conditions. This is really easy to follow. Your legal department can follow this. They can probably approve you to use the BSD license. The other thing that's really nice is there's only a limited number of open source licenses, so your legal department can probably go through and approve several of them for your use. And this is really nice because it takes out that procurement negotiation where you have to read the license terms with each vendor. If the vendors are providing you software using one of the open source licenses, it's a lot quicker and it gives you a lot more power as a consumer. Open source licenses are kind of monitored by this open source initiative, and they check to see which licenses actually meet that ideal of if you can download a copy of the software, you also can download a copy of the source code. I'm just going to go through a couple of the popular ones. BSD stands for Berkley Software Distribution, and it's kind of one of the original recipes saying, hey, here's how you can do an open source license. This is a license used by the Open Layers project. It's really popular mostly because it's so simple. One thing I really like about BSD is if I write software with the BSD license, it can be used by pretty much anybody. The most popular open source license currently is actually GPL3, and this is a license put together by the Free Software Foundation. It has a very interesting clause. Any modifications to the original application must be provided to those running the application. It also has an interesting clause called copy left. So this means that if you take some GPL code and mix it with your own proprietary code, you actually have to make your proprietary code GPL3. So it's a little bit sticky. Okay? Now this causes a certain amount of trepidation in industry, but it also causes a certain amount of joy in the user and developer community. So it's a very controversial license, but it does get the job done, and it's really doing well at protecting our freedoms as consumers and developers of software. So this is the license used by the GeoServer project. It's used by GeoServer. It's also used by companies you might not expect, such as Oracle. They publish the Java language under the GPL license. Another kind of one that's halfway in between is called LGPL, and this one lets you mix the code with your own proprietary software, so it's sometimes called like commercial friendly. This is used by the GeoTools library, which I work on. And one thing you might notice with these different restrictions, not all licenses can work together. So I've got this handy graph. So you can see that the license called the MIT license, I could take something that was released that way, and I could use it in a BSD program, no harm, no foul. I could take the BSD code and I could move it over to a GPL project, which is required to maintain the license, and that would also be fine. But these arrows don't go both ways. I can't take code from a GPL project and donate it back to a BSD project unless I get special permission. I'll just pause while he takes a photo. These will be online. If you are a developer or are considering this, there's a lovely resource called Choose a License to help you choose a license, and it explains these things fairly nicely. Keep in mind that the open source license only describes how the software is published, how it's given to everyone to consume the software. It's actually a different matter if developers are giving source code to a project and how a project is governed. So this leads me on to open collaboration. And this is where a lot of our FOSS4G community is focused. We really want to make sure that everyone can come to the party. So this is often expressed in terms of managing risk. If you've got a procurement department, there's well understood risks about procurement in terms of checking the background of the vendor, checking all the license terms, and so on. Open source helps mitigate some risks, like vendor lock-in, but it does expose you to other risks which you might not be familiar with, like license incompatibility, or you might want to check out the background of an open source project, make sure that it has a large number of different organizations supporting the project, because it does you no good to adopt a project if the one company that's working on it goes under. That project will be kind of in no man's land. Managing these risks is part of the project team's like governance, how they run their project. So if you're doing procurement and open source procurement, you want to review these terms. Okay? One thing that I really like is a software foundation does that review for you. So you can be assured that any OSGeo project is actually governed in a way that respects your freedoms. You can be assured that every location tech project not only is governed in a way that respects your freedoms, but they're all governed the same way. The key thing that we want to focus on here is we want to focus on open development. We want to make sure that anyone can take part. And you also want to make sure that it's transparent. So GeoServer maintains an issue tracker that you can see as a member of the public. Also, any decisions are made in public. If you're comfortable with change control, GeoServer has a proposal process where anyone can come along and make a recommendation on how to change the project. one thing that I need to keep in mind here is in order to publish a project as open source, we actually need to make sure we have permission from all the developers who made the project that we can publish their work to the internet. And that's something that we actually have to check. We might be checking the headers. We might actually have to contact all the developers individually and ask their permission. Some communities handle that by like getting an email from the developers. Some of them ask that a contribution license be assigned. I want to say that this is important. So if we fail to check the open source licenses, a product can actually be pulled from the market. And this actually happened to the GeoTools project. We had a developer accidentally commit some code from Esri, and we had to pull all prior releases of GeoTools until we fixed and addressed that problem. And that can be fairly alarming to users of the software if suddenly it's not available. So, buyer beware. Another really common mistake that's happening a lot with GitHub is we can get an employee, like a municipal employee, that provides a fix for software, and we say, great, thank you, and put it in. But that employee was actually not working as themselves, as an individual. They were working for the company or the municipality, so we need to get the company or the municipality's permission. Okay. The last point I want to make is there's a little bit of a difference between a software forge like GitHub, which allows developers to work together, but it's not a software foundation. It doesn't have any assurances on how the project is open source or governed, or even whether it's like, can legally be distributed. So we tend to work with two software foundations in our community, the FOSS4G community, Open Source Geospatial and Location Tech. But there are more players coming to the party. The Apache Software Foundation has a spatial information services working group, and we really look forward to growing our community. So once again, welcome to the FOSS4G community. Have a great week and enjoy the event. Thank you.